So hello, everybody out there. Welcome to a.r.e. Live. I'm Marc Teer, the founder of Black Spectacles, and today again I'm with Mike Newman. And today's going to be an awesome one. We're going to be discussing our first a.r.e. 5 exam, which is the project planning and design sort of case study mock exam we put forth earlier today. The project planning and design exam is one of those two exams that you would take if you're doing the a.r.e. 4 to 5 transition strategy. And that's the strategy where if you take 3 exams in a.r.e. 4, you can finish up with taking 2 exams in a.r.e. 5 and then be done with the a.r.e. And this exam, project planning and design, is one of those 2 a.r.e. 5 exams you'll need to take. I'm sure you guys all know that a.r.e. 5 launches on November 1st, so just a little more than 2 months from now. We're actually heads down here at Black Spectacles building our new a.r.e. 5 curriculum, which will launch on October 1st. So the timing of today's episode is absolutely perfect. I'm going to let Mike fill you in more on this exam and some of the details about a.r.e. 5, but I guess what I would say is it seems like a pretty smart way for NCARB to approach the exam, but I don't know. It's also really different from a.r.e. 4. So.
Yeah, there's some interesting questions about whether it's better to try to finish out in 4 or jump into the new 5.
Right. So, but before we get started, if you'd like to attend our next a.r.e. live broadcast, we're actually going to be focusing on the other a.r.e. 5 exam that's part of the a.r.e. 4 to 5 transition strategy, and that exam is project development and documentation. So we'll be doing that one in September. If you go to blackspectacles.com/podcast, you can register for that. And just like today, during the broadcast, you have a chance to ask questions to the group and Mike. If you don't know Mike, he's an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also the founder of Shed Studio, and he is our instructor for Black Spectacles online a.r.e. Exam prep curriculum. Which if you haven't already checked out our a.r.e. exam prep curriculum, head over to blackspectacles.com to watch any of the free tutorials from the courses. And today we have a special Black Spectacles promo code to share. We also, at the end of today's episode, will choose someone from all the folks who submitted their answers to the mock exam, and they'll win a free 1-month a.r.e. plus software learning Black Spectacles membership. And finally, we'll be tracking all the answers, and everybody who got everything right we'll get a free Black Spectacles t-shirt. So stay tuned for that as well. Tonight we'll be taking questions using the GoToWebinar question box, as well as on Twitter using the a.r.e. Live Podcast hashtag. So again, that's hashtag a.r.e. Live Podcast. So that's it. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Mr. Newman.
Okay, so we're going to start talking about this exam 4. Before we get into the exam 4, though, I think it's worth having a little bit of a discussion about just kind of the general format for the a.r.e. 5.0 just in general. Probably many of you have already been looking at it and thinking about it, but the gist of the situation is that instead of doing the silos that a.r.e. 4 did with the structures and systems and contracts and site planning all as separate exams, what the a.r.e. 5 is hoping to do is really to sort of model more closely to how an architecture project actually happens. And so the first 2 are, one is about sort of practice management, and then the second one is sort of a general overview of project management. And so those 2 are a little smaller and sort of these kind of overview ideas. But then the next 4, the exam 3, exam 4, exam 5, and exam 6, are all in the sort of sequence of how a project would roll forward. So the first one would be in that kind of programming, early pre-design, moving into sort of the beginning of schematic design kind of thinking. The second one of those, which would be exam 4, which is the one we're talking about tonight, would move into, all right, schematic design. Now we're going into design development. We're kind of narrowing down onto the project and really thinking about, we had some sort of opportunities from the third exam that we were talking about. Now we're taking those opportunities and we're really thinking of them as approaching it as a design project and trying to nail it down to get it sort of figured out exactly how we're going to move forward in the design. And then the next one is saying, okay, in exam 4, you were really looking at the ideas about kind of that design development, schematic design thinking. Now under exam 5, we're going to roll into, all right, we got to get into the final detailing. We're going to talk about how we communicate that information to code officials, to contractors. So it's all the, the final set of contract documents and kind of getting ready for permitting and bidding and all of those kinds of great fun. And then exam 6, the final of that series of 4, is going to be, okay, bidder was chosen, now we're moving into the contract phase where a contractor is chosen and the construction is going. And now there's a bunch of questions about what's your role at that point. What do you do at that moment in time when the construction starts? And so this is a very sort of, I think, overall kind of a smart idea. What NCARB is doing here is really trying to mimic an actual sort of life in an office and get you to sort of think in a sort of more layered sensibility in terms of how the exam works. However, as Marc was starting to allude to in the intro, it is actually a little tricky because now instead of looking at structures and focusing on it like you would in a.r.e. 4 and really sort of pounding away on structures for a while and then taking an exam, now you're going to be in a situation where you potentially could have structural questions at any of 3 or 4 different exams. They would be associated with that moment in the chronology, but they would still be structural questions. So for example, you might have a question about soils in exam 3 and thinking about what kind of foundation would be likely to go in given a certain set of soils that you would get in that kind of early programming phase where the client has given you a geotech report and you might have to respond to it in some way. But clearly you would also have structural questions in exam 4 where you're at that phase where the project has been defined a bit, and now we're trying to make our decisions. Maybe we've decided, okay, we're going to have a 40-foot span. Well, that's great. Is that going to be an open web steel, or is that going to be some sort of concrete precast system? So kind of structural choice and some of the decisions that would happen around that. Well, and in exam 5, which is really about that contract document level, you could easily have structural questions that are more about sort of calculations and how many bolts do you need, and the sort of getting into the detail end of those things, how the diaphragm is going to work in an earthquake situation. So you're starting to get into that deep level of discussion. And then when you get to the final one, that exam 6, which is the construction time, clearly there could be questions that revolve around issues that are sort of about structures, sort of about a contract, sort of about sort of helping the contractor get through the process and advising the client and everything that they need. So that's just one example. We could have that same conversation with systems. We could talk about contract issues, which would show up in any number of spots. There's a whole series of issues that will show up over and over again, and yet they have specific sense. They have a specific sort of logic to the moment in the chronology, but it's a little tricky to figure out how you would study for that as opposed to in the a.r.e. 4 version, because in the a.r.e. 4 you just study for contracts, and then you study for structures, and you study for systems. But those things that you have to study for all of it through the whole process. So personally, I applaud NCARB for moving in this direction because I think it's a better overall for everybody. But I don't know that it's going to make your life easier. So that's kind of one of the things to say right off the bat. The other thing to say is that there's some kind of interesting new versions of questions that are coming up, and I think they're telling in terms of the way that NCARB is trying to think about what does it mean to be an architect, what does it mean to be licensed, and the first thing to say is the vignettes are gone, right? So everybody can cheer for that. I have a sort of love-hate thing with the vignettes, so it's good and bad.
No, you don't. You have a 100% hate.
I actually do hate them, but they're so awful that there's a sort of love for that, the fact that they're so awful. So that's going to be going away. And then what's going to be replacing those, not in a direct way, but in that kind of sort of the next way that you're going to be thinking about this, the NCARB has decided, and this is built off of their research that they did by doing interviews with design firms, doing interviews with young architects who had just taken the exam, by talking to people in the schools. They've sort of interviewed lots of different people, and they realized that one of the issues they were having is that all of the questions were really focused on, let me ask you a specific question, and that you either know the answer or you don't. And some of those questions will be a little bit easier, some of them will be a little bit harder. The intention is that every exam that anybody would get would have some that are a little easier and some that are a little harder. But there's sort of these general questions that there's a set, in the question itself, there's a little bit of information, but essentially there's this idea that we're going to ask you this question. It's one of millions of possible questions you might get asked, but you have to know the answer to this one thing. Well, that's interesting, and that's the way it's been done for a long time. And the thought is, for a.r.e. 5, the thinking is, all right, instead of that, what we're really going to do is we're really going to focus on the idea that architecture isn't about that, but it's about sort of understanding a general scenario of situations and seeing information lap across. So you might be doing a project at one point and thinking about the structure, but you're also having a phone call with somebody about a change order that's coming. And so you're thinking about the combination of the change order and the structure, and you're then also having a moment where you have to think about, well, the fire ratings have been questioned as we're kind of putting together the permit set. So how do we make sure that everything's sort of fitting in together? And so kind of looking at these things more holistically and seeing a range of information and then trying to sort of answer questions from that range. And so one of the systems is the idea of the case study. And for the a.r.e. 5.0, the concept here is that every exam you get will have at least one case study. It's possible it might have 2 case studies. I think on the smaller exams, exam 1 and exam 2, it'd be very unlikely that you would have 2. But on the bigger exams, for example, this one that we're talking about, exam 4, I'm almost sure you would have 2 case studies. Same with exam 5, which would be the second one of that series that Marc was talking about for that transition. So the concept of the case study is that there would be a number of pieces of information, and that the questions might pertain to one of those pieces of information, or they might be something that you have to think about between a couple of those pieces of information. So it could be code, it could be program, it could be floor plans, it could be wall sections, it could be any number of different pieces of information that would give you some snippet of something about any given project. And then you're supposed to sort of go through and understand how those all kind of fit together, and then answer a series of questions. So in the a.r.e. 4.0, pretty much all of the questions are, here's a question, it's self-contained, all right? Next question, here's a question, it's self-contained, all right? Next question, here's a question, it's self-contained. In 5.0, at least the case studies, there'll be these series of pieces of information that you're given, and then there'll be anywhere from 12 to 20 to 25 questions that pertain just to that array of information. They've talked about it being as many as 24, 25. type questions. That actually seems like a lot to me. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up kind of pushing back down to the kind of 15 to 18 range. It's really hard to come up with that many questions about one set of scenarios. So I have a feeling that that's likely what's going to happen. But to start with, they've said anywhere from that kind of 12 to 25 range. The case studies will be at the end of the question set. So you would have a series of questions that are just simple, straightforward questions, kind of like what we have already in the 4.0. And then you'd get to the case study groupings. And once you got to that grouping, you would be able to sort of go into the case study. You'd see a bunch of tabs with all of the differing pieces of information that you have access to, and then from those tabs you would be able to go in and read or peruse or go through every part or however you want to approach it, and then you can look at the questions. So part of this is going to be, people are all going to be trying to come up with, well, what's the strategy for this? How do you go forward? Do you read the questions first and then go and look at the information and make sure that you know what the questions are like before you go into the information and then just find the answers to the questions? Or do you do a quick review of all of the different pieces of information so you have a sort of overarching idea of what the case study is about, and then from there go in and look at the questions one at a time, and when you get a new question, go back to that specific piece of information and try and find the correct bit of information to answer. I don't think there's going to be a right way to do it. I think different people are going to find the way that they feel comfortable, whether it's starting with the pools of information or whether it's starting with the questions. From my standpoint, I think it makes sense to make a sort of quick review of the general information so that you're kind of able to see what all the parts are, so that when you kind of go through the questions, you have a framework for it, but then go through more closely when you have an actual question. You really need to bear down and figure out exactly what's going on.